Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and in case you missed my incessant spamming over the last couple months, I released for the occasion of the 10th anniversary of Journey from 2012, a 2022 reimagining of the score called Traveler, a Journey Symphony, which featured the incredible London Symphony Orchestra, London Voices, and Tina Guo, plus a handful of additional wonderful musicians. I've spent the last couple months talking about it fairly constantly, so probably you are not discovering this for the first time. But if so, there's some links below to check it out. Today, I'm going to talk through some of the orchestration in the spirit of prior videos here that I've done called Under the Hood, in which I offered mostly production and video game music implementation kind of walkthroughs. Today's going to be a little bit more rigorously focused on just the orchestration and also what defined the reimagining of Journey versus simply it just being a reorchestration. I'm going to start with a couple of the early tracks, and you know, if people like it, if it's helpful, especially to fellow composers, then I suppose I can work my way through the entire album. But for the interim, here's just a taste of the inner workings of the beginning. Loaded here the original Nascence, and I decided for this one piece to be especially faithful to the original. So when I play it, that's the original Tina Guo cello performance done in early 2009. I've told that story a million times, but the long and short of it was that I was tasked to write a theme for Journey by Genova Chen from that game company. Based on the early kind of just conceptualization of it, decided to cook something up that afternoon. It just kind of struck me in one of those rare moments of feeling like, oh, I think I've figured it out, and recorded Tina immediately. For the new Traveler version, we re-recorded that line in much the same way. It was done without a click. We did it at Capitol, but I did, in fact, use my old Rode NT2 mic as part of the cocktail of mics that were set up by Greg Hayes, who engineered the session in Capital A. So all of this is unchanged. I had no intention of modifying it. The idea was to begin the album with a reminder of how Journey was, and then start to make departures in order to suggest that this will not be the same. So all of this initially is essentially verbatim. Some astute observers have noticed that there was a triangle part very quietly in the background during this second section that I did in fact get rid of. Where it becomes different is in the third iteration of the theme, which is what I want to focus on. If I open up here my sequence, first off, if you listen to the original, you can hear that it's Tina jumping up to her upper register, and then the string orchestra coming in behind her. And if you listen very carefully, you can realize that Amy Tatum playing the C flute is actually doubling Tina at pitch. And you get it like this. Again, this can be easily seen in the as noted video of the original Nascence. Okay, so the question is how to make that different, but somehow close. So if I open my sequence here, I want to focus on the two biggest things that made it different. This is my mock-up that I made as part of the arrangement process. I'll just say in advance, this is not a very good mock-up because who was I trying to impress? There was no client, as it were. There was no game developer, producer, filmmaker, etc. For whom having a good mock-up was important. So I'm just putting that out there in advance. My apologies that this kind of sounds like ass. So if you hear the mock-up of everything at that moment where the melody undergoes its third statement, it sounds like this. Just focus on that phrase for a moment. If you look at the final conductor score, first thing you might take note of is that it wasn't a C flute that is doubling Tina anymore. It's now an alto recorder played by the magnificent Kristen Agus, who flew to London and sat in with the LSO quite wonderfully. And then the two biggest, most salient differences can be found here, the addition of the brass, and here, the addition of the choir. In general, because there are so many textural synth pads and things like that throughout Journey, my default assumption was places where I want to try to kind of revisit the literal use of those synths can be done via this sort of ethereal presence of the choir. And even though there weren't those big synth pads in Nascence, I wanted to plant the seed that that's going to be a major color difference. So if I play it again with just the choir isolated in the mock-up, you can hear they sound like this. So they're basically just following along the very simple harmonies and adding in a few little rubs of their own, independent of the rest of the strings. And then same thing for the brass. So it's somewhat on the dark side of it, and obviously, not leveraging any of the upper register of the brass. The sum total of which, when you listen to it all in its final recording, final mix and master, comes together, I think reasonably nicely. One of the things that I have to point out was that the dynamic control of the performers in the London Symphony was so absolutely outrageous that when this high note in the violins comes in bar 22, I remember saying to them, I really want you to sneak in. We don't want to immediately hear you. That would be this note here. And it was hilarious to me because they snuck in so effectively that you basically don't even hear them until the second beat of the bar. Even from the podium, I was watching their bows move, and it just emerged out of the fog. I'd never seen an orchestra play with that level of dynamic control especially on a sight read. It was it was just amazing. So you can see this arguably is a reorchestration far more than it is a reimagining. And so if this was the be-all, end-all of it, you would be inclined to expect that the album was going to essentially just take the original Journey tracks and be done with it. Now, if you notice, the original does, one more little phrase and then promptly stops. But I thought I want to extend the phrase a little longer to indicate that I don't feel beholden to the source material. I mean, if you want to listen to the original Journey, by all means, go listen to the original Journey. So here's the mock-up of the way I extended it. And you'll see it is basically just a natural continuation of the preceding material. So as with before, the presence of the brass and the choir mark the biggest aesthetic difference. If I isolate them, you can see it gets a little bit crunchy. And even just looking at the piano roll, I think you can see the idea here where it starts off with these fairly open spaced harmonies and gets denser and denser and denser until it is all but a complete cluster here by about bar 29 before that tension is released and we end up with, what is effectively just an open fifth orchestrated up the octaves. Let's actually take the choir and brass out, and you can hear now those other elements. So everybody's basically in service of the same general thing. And then just for due diligence, one final time, the actual performance by the LSO. So, it's simple. It's nearly the same as the original, but hopefully it plants the seed that some major differences are going to appear that differentiate this from the original album. So with that said, now I'm going to just take a little look at a few key moments in The Call that I think were fun to do and hopefully are fun to look at. Okay, I've just pulled up the sequence for The Call. After the initial opening cutscene with the sort of POV of the meteor traveling over the open desert, which I did recreate a kind of version of, the thing I want to focus on is the challenge of how to make what is effectively a continuous drone interesting. So let me just play a moment of that first awakening in the graveyard that happens at the beginning of the game from the original. This is a combination of my voice, a little bit of bass flute from Amy, little hints of some kind of processed marimba rolling, and textural just synth pads on a long continuous B. Now, I think when designing kind of undulating long pitches like this, you can go a long time and stay interesting by just sculpting the sound. You know, I jump forward, it's still fundamentally just a B. This is the kind of thing I don't particularly enjoy subjecting orchestras to. So the question is, okay, well, how to make that feel interesting? Well, as I mentioned before, the choir became my best friend here. And so initially, it is effectively just a big open B. So if I go to the conductor score, you can see we have a harp bisbigliando on a low open fifth, the choir holding this fifth, cello and basses holding the low note, little log drum just kind of flourish, a low timpani holding this note, and for a few moments, I think that can sustain our interest. But then the thing that I think starts to really demonstrate the way to make this feel more orchestral, or dare I say symphonic, is what you see happen now. Bar 33, where the strings and mutes come in just to offer a bit of a commentary. So here again is the mock-up. So you see, the strings come in, a little suggestion, kind of broken fragment, vaguely reminiscent of the theme, and then echoed again in the bass flute. Never get tired of that sonorous low bass flute. Here's like choir and bass flute, for example, in that moment. It's just a lovely combo, and we had 3 magnificent bass flutes sitting in with the LSO. So here you can hear how it actually sounds. There was that. And then this little interjection in the percussion. Okay, so what's happening there? It's just simple chords in the strings coming in, sort of echoing that first moment. And then the second, again, there's nothing that happens that's sort of remotely analogous to these rises out above the endlessly droning. You can see the harp here just maintaining that open, sort of open fifth B chord. And it's also worth noting that I give the woodwinds a bit of excitement to handle during this moment as well. After the bass flute, we add in the others. Just a little clarinet, which can be so useful. You can see here, clarinets 1 and 2 plus bass. We actually had 4 clarinets in the orchestra because I wanted a dedicated bass and contrabass. So we had clarinet 1 playing only regular B-flat clarinet, clarinet 2 and 3 both playing B-flat and bass, and then clarinet 4 playing both bass and contrabass. So in general, I usually only had 3 playing at a time, but I wanted occasional moments of 3-part low bass or contrabass and 3-part normal B-flat clarinet. This is one of those moments that actually we mix and match them. And so the clarinets with the muted strings just gives a nice little bit of movement and energy so that the piece doesn't feel stagnant, because again, I think really, really, really harmonically static and boring material works great when it's synths and you can kind of keep stirring the pot to make sure that things never lose interest. But it doesn't ever seem to sit as well with an orchestra. Plus, it's incredibly tedious and uninteresting for them to play, and they get bored. So here's that one more time. Now, I want to highlight this because this was kind of a funny moment. So if you listen back to the original, it's a little bit difficult to tell, but one of the sounds was I had actually found a string effects library that I flipped backwards and put through some various kind of reverb effects here. That sound is based on this aleatoric effect where the strings can basically very slowly move their finger up and down a given string and kind of smoothly pass over these harmonic nodes. This is a very famous effect, of course, from the Firebird of Stravinsky. It was written out in a sort of rhythmically timed way there, but it's a very effective and simple aleatoric gesture. So you'll see, I thought, well, look, I managed to manipulate that synth into this effect. Let's bring that in earnest. So here I have them, you'll see on their D string, continuous natural harmonic gliss, just sort of giving them a guide of what I mean by those nodes. So here's how that sounded. If you listen carefully, you can actually see that the cellos go away, the violas are divisi on some trills, and then the harp is actually kind of mimicking that harmonic gliss. Then the bass flute comes back again with a little more fragment, and then little interjections. And then another one of these chord rising moments. So you see, it's first off, one of the effects that you can achieve that I'm quite fond of is by severely dividing up the orchestra. You can create a lot of movement, but individual lines tend to get lost. So if I isolate just the strings here, you see there's kind of a bit of independent movement to the parts. Ending in another cluster that gives way to this open sonority. And that's the kind of thing that really, I think, just helps there feel like a continuous sense of tension and release and breathing in and out, inhale, exhale. That keeps it from being boring. And maybe I have a short attention span, but that's the kind of thing that to me really turned a droning piece that worked fine on account of the synths that I was using, and hopefully made it more properly kind of orchestral or symphonic. It's worth noting that the kind of wispy high note that you're hearing at the top end of that is not actually a flute, it's a zhao, which Kristen is playing in the orchestra. And then we return. Now, a little longer and in tandem with harmonics in the cello, which is, again, just one of those absolutely glorious textures that I love. You know, I use that a lot in Erica and the bass ensemble. So these divisi celli on harmonics, viola divisi on trills, the violins giving us the continuous glisses. And then the last section I wanted to showcase to just give an example of this idea of thick moving divided lines is you'll see the violas come in and start playing this little variation on the theme, bum, 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 and then the other half of the violas start to echo it a few beats later. And as we go, you'll see it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and everyone that's coming in is actually playing a variation on the theme, but at their own individual starting points. And so if I isolate, once again, just the strings during this section, it's this technique I use over and over and over and over, get denser and denser and denser, all these moving lines. And the thing that I'm a fan of is the consistency of material. It's just the Journey theme over and over and over in increasingly rapid sort of iteration and succession. So it's getting faster and from a rhythmic standpoint and tighter together, but also kind of crunchy and dissonant, like a big cluster chord. And you can see we're adding in, more and more percussion. The horns sort of come in, and we're adding in these sort of swelling low notes in the contrabass clarinet and the bassoons and contrabassoon. Before I play the final, you can just see in isolation here how the low brass and winds sound on their own as part of that. English horn is one of the contributors to the melody. And then I get them out of the way a little earlier than the strings in order to just help make it preemptively exhaling before the true full exhale. So here's the final, and we'll take a look at the piano roll. So, I think it's also, by the way, worth noting, you'll see I leave a lot of markers in my sequence here to leave instructions for my music copying team, Susie Sider and Steve Giuliani. And this was a funny one where I wrote, the mock-up here is too loud. The dynamics really should peak around mezzo piano. And so you can see that we get really kind of at a peak dynamic of mezzo piano. The rest of the piece moves forward from there in a way that's reasonably straightforward, and the as noted, I think, can kind of walk through that. But I wanted to just showcase these moments where I'm violating the essence of what is an endless drone in the original for the sake of it being more orchestrally interesting. And so I hope that this is just, a nice little interesting taste, and I'll get into some more nitty-gritty on other ones. And if you have specific moments that are of interest, I'll leave them in the comments, and I'm happy to pull those up and step through them. And hopefully by peeling back the curtain a bit on this piece, it might be of use to anybody who's interested in this kind of thing for whatever they want to use it for. So thanks again, and just lest it go one day without saying again, to all those who supported the album, who bought the vinyl, who have picked it up on Bandcamp or playlisted it on Spotify, all that kind of thing, my endless thank you to you. The album was an absolute dream of a lifetime, and to see it reach people and get the kind of response it's gotten has been just a validation that I struggle to find the right words for. So thank you again, and we'll see you for some more of these, and I'll continue to upload as noted videos on the rest of the album and other fun, cool things to come as we get here into the summer. So thanks, and take care.